I'm Michael Ambrosino from Latin Biz Today. Today we are exploring the work to create a unique museum to capture the remarkable, rich history of the American Latino culture, the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Latino. I have two esteemed gentlemen here today to help unpack this subject. Danny Vargas, the chairman of the board of the Friends of the National Museum of the American Latino, who's also president of Varcom Solutions, a nationally recognized marketing and public relations firm, and Estuardo Rodriguez, the president of the Friends of the National Museum of the American Latino, and principal and founder of the Rabin Group that focuses on government affairs in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for the invitation.
So good to have you here. Danny, let's start with you. I know this is a complicated project. I wonder if you could just unpack the recent history and the process to make this special museum a reality.
Well, thanks, Michael. And again, thank you for having us. It's important to point out that what this museum is about making sure that we have a more complete and accurate telling of American history, looking back at the more than 500 years of Latino contributions to the founding, the building, the shaping, and the defending of this nation. The efforts to create a museum, however, started in earnest in 1996 when a task force put together by the Smithsonian itself found that not only was the Smithsonian doing a poor job of portraying Latino contributions in their exhibits, it's as if they were doing it on purpose. And they delivered a report in 1996 called Willful Neglect. Fast forward a few years, there was a bill introduced in Congress to set up a commission to study the feasibility of creating a National American Latino Museum, which was one of the 10 recommendations in the Willful Neglect report. That bill was signed into law in 2008 by President Bush. I was appointed to that commission. We started our work in 2009 and delivered our report to Congress and the President in May of 2011, saying three basic things. One, there was a clear and pressing need for the museum. Two, it really should be part of the Smithsonian Institution. And number three, it really ought to be on the National Mall. And in that same year, in the fall of 2011, was the first time that a bill was introduced to authorize the Smithsonian to move forward with the creation of this museum. And here we are now, 9 years later, several iterations of that bill in several Congresses, where the bill was passed unanimously on a voice vote on July 27th in the House of Representatives, and now we're trying to get the bill passed in the Senate.
And Estuardo, can you speak to the concept of our history? It's a uniquely Latino, but also the history of America. And we spoke before, and you said that it really requires a unique lens to tell the story of such a diverse set of concentric cultures.
Sure, absolutely. I would start by just throwing a number out there. Danny and I often, start many of our conversations around the fact that 500 years of history is really, the massive window that we're talking about that contributed to and led up to the success and the growth of this nation. The issue is when we begin to spread out all of the factors that came together across those 500 years. They include the Spanish from across the water. They include the Mexican and the indigenous Mexican community that were already part of this continent. They include Central South America and the contributions from the Caribbean and Puerto Rico. And you see all of these pieces coming together over 5 centuries. And it's very difficult to sit down with anyone to say, okay, this is how it fits together. This is the American experience. And therefore, just give us the museum and we'll figure it out, because of how diverse that is. And yet we still identify as one community because of the culture, the music, the language, and honestly, the experience that we've had within the United States. If you go to Latin America, I'm sure that you'll see many flags from all over waving and being very distinct from each other. But the US Latino experience, even with all the flavors that it comes from, whether they were here already for hundreds of years before it was the United States, or they came across those 5 centuries, their identity and experience is brought together by what has happened here and how they have contributed to the founding of the first city in the United States, which is St. Augustine, and some of the major Southwestern cities that we currently, or states that we currently pronounce in English, even though their origins are in Spanish, right? So I think that's the challenge that we have ahead of ourselves. When we talk about an American Latino museum, people assume that we want to create some sort of Latino museum that is about Latin America. But we're actually trying to open up an American history museum. it's just from the Latino experience. That's the distinction.
And as Danny was talking about before, I mean, you know, the report actually showcases the fact that you can go to most museums and that experience is omitted.
Absolutely.
And how shameful that is. Speaking of challenges, I mean, Danny, if you could outline some of the significant private-public partnerships that are underlying this process, it's estimated that the museum will cost between $650 and $700 million. It's easy to imagine it will cost more when you think about the years it might take to actually put a shovel in the ground and actually build a foundation. Can you kind of describe the slow but steady climb upwards when it comes to actually trying to raise that amount of money?
Well, I'll start by saying that, you know, Estuardo and I have a really challenging job in trying to make sure that the legislation gets passed in Congress to move forward with this museum. But I'll be honest with you, the job of curating this museum and the first director that's hired, it's going to be incredibly challenging. As Estuardo mentioned, this is going to be a multi-dimensional, complex, complicated story to tell, but fascinating at the same time. Now, what we've had the benefit of is that there was most recently a Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture that was developed, built, and opened in the years that we've been looking at the American Latino Museum. We've been able to sort of see their footsteps and follow in many of the different areas that they were able to achieve success. So a lot of the corporations and foundations, for example, that have already contributed to the building of the African American Museum have expressed interest in working with us to make similar donations and contributions to our museum. We've benefited as a 501c3 from working with corporate partners that have allowed us to continue our mission and our efforts to educate the public about the importance of this museum and the importance of highlighting Latino contributions to our history, as well as the complexity of the Latino community today. I mean, I think that's the other aspect that's missing. It is a look at the past, but it's also a look at the present and the 60 million plus Hispanics that are contributing greatly to this country, and a view to the future, where we know that the Census Bureau tells us that by the year 2060, Latinos will make up 30% of the population. So if we hope to remain a strong, thriving, and vibrant nation, that segment of the population needs to feel acknowledged, engaged, and invested in our future. So it really is about inspiring future generations as much as it is about commemorating the contributions of the past.
I've heard that 50% of the costs need to be supported by private gifts. I was curious, is that traditional? And if it is, are there specific challenges with having to raise half of the cost of a museum of this nature?
Yeah, that was the model that the African American Museum followed. It was a 50-50 public-private partnership. The American Indian Museum was more 70-30, 70% public and 30% from the private sector. That's why we followed that model of 50-50. It'll be challenging, particularly in times of economic distress, but you know, it's going to take several years to build this museum, right? So it's going to take, you know, 8, 10, 12 years to actually open the doors to this museum. So we've got time to be able to do the hard work of making sure that the private sector, corporations, foundations, individuals have an opportunity to contribute to this important institution, this legacy project.
Yeah, let me just jump in and say, yes, we have some time before the shovel goes in the round, goes into the ground, but the work is now in terms of raising that money. You know, worst case scenario, we can always pull some brand new credit cards under Danny's name, but that's a last case scenario. So corporate America has to step up. Individuals, philanthropists, donors, those individuals with, look, I could say Silicon Valley can pay for this in a blink of an eye, right? Our community similarly must understand the value of this museum, because it not only will stand there on the National Mall for millions of tourists, but it will help better explain and set forth the narrative of Latinos and Latinas in the country, which addresses a whole sort of array of issues in our society to better value and train and create the pipelines for opportunities for that next generation of leadership in business and arts and sports and science. So think beyond the actual building itself, which is crucial. It's getting the narrative correct in this country.
Well, let's stick with that for a while, because if you look at an aerial map of the excuse me, the National Mall, you recognize that all the major Smithsonian museums are right there. So of course you would want your monument to this amazing culture to be alongside. Right. So can you talk about the importance of that, and specifically what's your ongoing relationship with the Smithsonian now to make that happen?
You know, it's great that we are in this moment of time, this moment in history, where the current Secretary of Smithsonian was the first director of the African American Museum, someone who understands the importance of telling the American story from different lenses and from different perspectives, who went through the hard work of making sure that they were able to collect the private sector donations, getting the appropriations from Congress, curating and getting the content for that museum. So he understands how not only beneficial it is, but also the challenges associated with it. And it definitely has to be on the National Mall. I think in the bill itself that we got passed in the House, it identified 4 potential sites. So we know that there are at least 4 possibilities, but also allows the Smithsonian to go out and seek out other possible locations on the National Mall. It really is important to make sure that the 20 to 30 million visitors that come to the National Mall each year have an opportunity to walk on the nation's front yard to be able to get to this important institution.
Yep, I'll add really quickly to that, just so that people understand the distinction here. We are running a campaign to create a National American Latino Museum that will one day be part of the Smithsonian, an official part and museum of the Smithsonian Institution. But the Smithsonian is a government body, so they cannot get involved officially, cannot lobby for, cannot advocate for. The leadership of Secretary Bunch is very important in that he himself has testified before Congress to say improving the diversity of the stories and exhibits within the Smithsonian is critical to his work. That opens the door by itself to the acceptance that an American Latino Museum is missing and therefore should join the other museums on the National Mall. And for that matter, as we know, a National Women's History Museum is also in the works. And for the same reason, it should also advance. But that's the opportunity that we have been waiting for a secretary like Lonnie Bunch to say publicly, the Smithsonian is deficient. The diversity of our American story needs to be expanded. And that's where we are. And I think that's one of the major reasons why we've received such bipartisan support in Congress, knowing that the Smithsonian is willing and prepared to take this on.
I think it's easy when we talk about this subject to kind of circle it with hypotheticals because it doesn't exist right now. It's very political in nature. You talk about how much it would take to raise and the lobbying it would take to actually get the legislation through. I'd like you guys to just kind of take a moment to visualize what it could look like with this context. I mean, we always call America a melting pot, but oftentimes it feels like a culturally and racially divided land. And as I was looking at the premise and the history of this museum, I thought the power of a museum like this to bring people together is remarkable. And I was wondering if you could describe in your own imagination what it would be like to walk through a museum of this nature in terms of the change it could make to not just the immediate culture of Washington, but to the nation.
You know, a lot of times when I speak about this initiative to different audiences, I usually end my talk by saying how important it is for me personally and my family. I've been involved in this thing for 12 years now, 13 years, Estuardo, or even more. For me personally, it's about being able to walk in with my children or my future grandchildren into this museum so they can see all the stories of these important contributions. But I also talk about the vision of a young Latina born today who on her 6th grade field trip is able to go to Washington, D.C. and visit the nation's capital, and she can marvel at the monuments, and she can visit Capitol Hill and go to the national museums, including the American Latino Museum, and see the stories of contributions of families like hers. And she can leave that museum proud not only to be a Latina, but proud to be an American. This really is a red, white, and blue patriotic initiative to fill out the missing chapters of American history, to give us a better sense of who we are as a nation. The reason why 3 of our 4 most populous states have Spanish names associated with them. You know, there's a lot of history that's missing, and it's not just Latino history, it's American history. So that's why it's so important that we make sure that this initiative has had bipartisan support from the very beginning.
Estuardo, it was mentioned again that Latinos are the most underrepresented ethnic group in the entire Smithsonian Institution. Has that been a really powerful backdrop when it comes to creating advocacy and fundraising for the project so far?
That's a great question. I'm inclined to say no, just because I think I started early on with that as a motivation. But I think that as you see what has been transpiring through history, the last 20 years or so, the constant struggle to make sure that Hollywood steps up and presents stories as diverse as they should be. Music, the news, political media, that there's always clearly some sort of division, some sort of rhetoric that divides or paints the Latino community in a certain way, or doesn't paint them enough in the positive way as the leaders that they are. I think Danny and I could probably rattle off 10 names of Latinas and Latinos who have led Fortune 500 companies, who have revolutionized television, like Desi Arnaz with the 3-camera setup for sitcoms, and on and on. There's so many examples, and yet we struggle to see where these stories are for the mere purpose of simply relating to, getting excited by, having the role models and that inspiration for generations to step up and be what they should be. Sonia Sotomayor by herself, I'm sure she did not have a Latina on the Supreme Court that she was told about could one day be her, but now she is that for so many young Latinas out there. So the inspiration and energy behind it, I think, started with that initial idea that there's so many stories that are clearly ignored. And then it became something bigger, that we could help change the narrative today about who is American. And I think that the challenge is for our community as well, because as we have done in many of our presentations around the country, we have asked the community, how many Puerto Ricans in the audience, how many Colombians, and how many Peruvians? And there's always that, cheer from the Boricuas and from the Peruanos and the Colombianos. But then you ask them, ¿cuántos Americanos? And there is a pause. There's a hesitation there from them to respond, because they're not used to that. There's a self-identity issue there. And so we see even there, within our own community, that's what the museum would mean. It would mean an opportunity to actually educate our own community to embrace that identity that is also very much American, and the role that we have played to date in making this nation truly great.
I can imagine it's a remarkably intimate experience for families, like you said, Danny, walking through there and seeing themselves in an entirely new light, maybe for the first time.
Right.
So, Danny, HR 2024 passed overwhelmingly. You're now working to pass Senate Bill 1267. You said in a previous conversation, you're fourth in goal, inches away. You have 43 co-sponsors in the Senate. You have hashtag Latino Museum Now that's just doing great on social media. Can you kind of describe, either one of you or both, the current work to get more senators on board, to build, this energy to finally get that touchdown and get this really underway?
Well, Michael, this really is, as I mentioned, fourth and goal. We've come so far over the last 26 years to get us to where we are now. We're within striking distance of getting this bill passed and then signed by the president and beginning the actual hard work of building this museum. We don't want to leave the ball on the 1-yard line. We really want to get this done. So we're working really hard with our national partners, with our board of directors, our chairman's advisory council, our regional leadership network, our affiliates and supporters all over the country, hundreds of thousands of people working hard to try to convince a smattering of senators. A country of 330 million people right now, we just need another 14 or 20 to be able to get us over the finish line. So we're twisting arms, we're convincing, we're cajoling, we're urging, we're pleading. And then eventually we're going to be insisting that we get the support to get this done. Because it's important not only for our community, it's important for our country. It's important for a lot of healing that really does need to take place, a lot of educating, a lot of inspiring that we've got to get about the business of doing. So, let's enough with the discussion about whether or not this is a good thing to do. We know it's a good thing to do. Let's legislate. Let's get it done. Let's get the bill passed. Let's get it signed. And actually roll up our sleeves and start working on building this museum.
Danny sounds like a lobbyist.
In terms of political action, let's get specific now. How can people learn more and get more involved and help you both get that that last push and make it really happen?
Absolutely. Thank you for that opportunity. AmericanLatinoMuseum.org. AmericanLatinoMuseum.org has a landing page to take action, to participate. But we do a lot more there, not just the education of the Senate and what they have to do. There's absolutely an opportunity for you to do that, but we need to build our base of support as well. Combining our social media, we might have close to 400,000 people that support the Latino Museum campaign. But we know 60 million plus Latinos around the country. You know, we should be in the millions. We need the Justin Bieber social media numbers is what we need. We should be counting on that groundswell of support so that it really does become, as Danny just said, a no-brainer. This is American history plugging in hundreds of years that's not available right now, not only on our national mall, but in history books around the country. And we honestly believe that if you build this in Washington, educate more people, then the rest will happen as well. That the history books will also start adding. We'll stop seeing people in fighting Chicano studies in Arizona and other parts of the Southwest, for whatever reasons that they do. Embracing our history is ultimately, the American history is ultimately the goal here. So going to the AmericanLatinoMuseum.org website allows you to find out how you can get involved in many ways, not just with the legislation, also with donating and supporting financially, because we absolutely need that, but also just educating on the various programs that we have. The National Design Contest that allows youth to submit their vision of what an American Latino Museum means to them as part of an annual contest that we have. So go there, start there, but get involved and share it and bring all of your familia into that campaign. Together is the only way we can do this, because Danny and I are just two individuals. Behind us, there are at least 10 other staffers in different parts of DC and the country that help us on this. But it has to be more. It has to be hundreds of thousands of us out there stomping our feet, making our voice heard, and making sure this bill passes this year. It's a no-brainer for Congress to pass this right during Hispanic Heritage Month between September 15th, October 15th. What a win for the Senate, for Congress, and for this White House to pass this legislation.
I want to go back to the design contest, because I actually thought that was really ingenious and an intimate way to bind people to the process. And I wonder if you could talk about, as you've seen some of the contributions come through the website, have you learned something remarkably new about the vision of what this museum could be that you actually didn't imagine you'd see?
Sure. Two things come to mind when you ask that. Number one, how many designs did I get that had Selena on them? I'm gonna have my own section in the museum of all the Selena posters. Number two, the Frida Kahlo designs that I get. Those are the number two designs that we get, which are awesome, and I love them. And I think hopefully we can do something with those, whenever the museum does open up. But the other part that I think is very important is that we also were faced with designs that challenged what the value was of creating this museum. There are people who honestly are fearful that either the museum will be too Mexican or too Spanish, or justify or redo history or rewrite history in a way that leaves some community out. And people submitted that through their art. We embraced it. We submitted the votes the designs to the public, those finalists, that is. But we've kept them all, because it's important to be reminded that your story as a Latina or Latino in the United States is not the only story. Your experience is not the only experience. And what your family has contributed is vitally important, but so is everyone else's. So that job for the Smithsonian curator to open up this museum is going to be very difficult. And I think, God willing, we're there to open that door, cut the ribbon, but we will also be there because of the years of experience that we've had in running this campaign to remind them to not leave anyone out and not try to justify one story over another, because that would be the biggest mistake.
How many museums, as a charter, say we are going to cover 500 years and 24 countries into the process of building a museum? It's both righteous and obviously the correct way to go, and it's just a remarkable task to undertake right now. Danny, when it comes to remarkable series of partnerships that make something like this possible, can you talk about what those partnerships look like in terms of art and culture, advocacy, business, and especially higher education?
No, great, Michael. We've got over 100 national partners, and they span the spectrum from the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce to academic organizations to philanthropic organizations and charitable organizations. Our collection of partners is truly impressive and diverse and spans the gamut of every aspect of American society, which is reflective of our community. You know, the one thing I was going to mention earlier is the one thing that I've learned is that we're not a race, we're a culture. We're Afro Latinos, we're Asian Latinos, we're blonde haired and blue eyed, we're mulattoes and mestizos and everything in between. We're a culture made up of some very foundational common values around family and faith and freedom and optimism and opportunity and passion and pride. And those are the qualities really most in need in our country today. So when we go into a museum like this and we see how important family is to our community and see the fact that, you know, if you go into the African American Museum, one of the things that has struck me the most is that on every level, there are these booths with tinted glass where you can go in and you can provide your own oral history of your experience. That's something I would love to see in the Latino Museum, where people can go in and tell oral histories about their family experience. Because whether you're a recent immigrant to this country or whether your family has been here for 20 generations, the contributions that the Latino community has made has been innumerable and immense in every single aspect of society. You know, from the arts and culture to science and medicine to sports and entertainment and business and politics. It's just an incredibly rich, diverse, and vital aspect of American history. Imagine, you know, I talk about sometimes if you've seen those movies where you go back into the past and you alter something and it changes the present. Imagine the United States without roughly the lower half of the country. Imagine if General Washington had not won the War of Independence. Imagine if we didn't have the 500,000 Latino troops fighting in World War II, or the thousands of Hispanic surnames etched on the wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. We are intrinsically interwoven into the fabric of America, and it's that story that needs to be told.
It's impossible to talk about anything these days without mentioning COVID-19 and the effect it's had on everyone, specifically as it relates to the Latino community. It's often the heroism of the essential workers, but also disproportionately how Black and brown people are being hit by this virus. But I was specifically curious, you know, you have a very complicated project right now. How is COVID affecting the work you're trying to accomplish to get the museum to come to pass?
Absolutely. The COVID-19 has had an impact on our efforts. The Senate, the House, highly focused on making sure that there's a stimulus, that there's relief, that people are getting a check to help them get by, as we've seen record unemployment. But even with that, the House, as we mentioned early on, was able to pass the bill. Unanimous consent because it had such overwhelming support of co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle. We expect the same from the Senate. We don't expect the need for a long drawn out process with a committee hearing or a markup of some kind. The Senate can, in fact, pick up the House bill and pass that bill. It's a much faster process. But in the meantime, there is a Senate bill, 1267, that has 43 sponsors. There likely will be many more who are going to sign on to that bill going into September. And what we expect is that when they surpass that 50 mark, hopefully that 60 mark for a supermajority, then we're able to quickly pivot to the House bill, pick that bill up and push it through, even with all of the other demands and priorities that this Congress has, because I don't think anybody will argue. There are many priorities right now. This is a historic time in the country. We can chew gum and walk at the same time.
Just a final thought to close off our conversation is we are living in unprecedented times. I mean, COVID notwithstanding, the idea that there is a whole reawakening of various political processes that deal with Black and brown people. We've seen protests all across the country. And I wonder, the conversations, the depth, the amount of learning that's going on by a wide variety of different communities really reflect a level of intelligence and education that's pretty much I've not seen since the 60s. And even then, I don't think it was as profound as it is right now. When you think about the museum as a catalyst for these kind of conversations, and specifically as a vehicle for healing, do you have a different sense of hope that you didn't a year ago at this time?
Well, it's a pretty profound question, Michael. I think it's important that we understand the context in which we're operating right now. where there is an additional level of focus and attention being placed on narratives and perspectives and stories that have not been told, and experiences that have not been shared. So to the extent that we're at a moment in time where we're moving forward with this museum, advancing our efforts to tell a story of America, an American narrative from the lens of the Hispanic community, I think the timing is right for that. I think it shows that there is an important pressing need for it right now, more than ever. So we're making sure that people understand how important it is that we move forward with this. I will say that, you know, from the perspective of the legislature and Congress and getting this done, as we mentioned earlier, this should be a no-brainer. We've got to be able to identify ways to be able to commemorate the contributions that the Hispanic community has made throughout history, that is making today. We are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, and not only in the case count, but in the deaths, as well as the essential workers that are out there that are stocking the shelves, that are, you know, providing the food, that are doing the work and cleaning our cities and tending to our citizens in hospitals and so forth. So all of that needs to be recognized and commemorated, and this is the time to make it happen.
Michael, I would add that about 2 weeks ago, we observed the 1-year anniversary of the El Paso shooting. And why that matters to us in this effort is because it's clear that the madman who took it upon himself to stop this invasion that he believed was happening had no understanding of American history. He was running 6 hours out of his way to a community that probably has looked the same for hundreds of years. A community that relied on cross-border business, education, healthcare. It's not changed in hundreds of years, and yet he ran there in some self-appointed sense of duty to protect the nation. If our history books and if our National Mall did a better job of educating people, perhaps it could also address the ignorance that sometimes is at the root of hatred. So I don't attempt to say that we will fix everything with the museum, but clearly history and education must be told to better educate people about their surroundings and what America really is and where we've been and who we are.
Well, again, for everyone who's watching this video and comes to the Latin Biz Today site, if you want to find out more about the museum, these two gentlemen, and what they're trying to accomplish, you can go to AmericanLatinoMuseum.org. Thank you both so much for speaking with me today at Latin Biz Today, and thanks to everyone for watching. I'm Michael Ambrosino for Latin Biz Today. There are many more informative videos, podcasts, and articles at LatinBusinesstoday.com.